to Farmers and Fishers, Portraits, Words, and Tools. My name is Joseph Ingoldsby, and I'm the curator of this exhibit, currently showing at the Town Hall in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Farmers, Fishers, Portraits, Words, and Tools is a timeline in the history of agriculture and farming and fishing on the South Coast. We begin with the 18th century and look at the traditions of home and hearth. Then we look at the farmsteads, the barnyards, and specific industries such as the dairy industry, the poultry industry, the growing of crops. Then we take you to the coast where the seaweed gatherers and the shellfishermen, and along the tidal rivers for the anadromous fish of the herring and the mackerel and shad and smelt runs that were so popular in the 19th century, but today have dwindled down to nothing. And then out onto the open sea with the pelagic fishing, where you have everything from the lobstermen to the fishing for swordfish off of the shores. Then I'll take you into the 20th century and 21st century, looking at aquaculture and hydroponics, and how a younger generation is coming on board with innovative educational programs at the New Bedford Vocational Technical High School, at the Sea Lab, at UMass Dartmouth, and other organizations and institutions. I'll also be tracing out how the contemporary farming of today is following those traditions of their grandparents and great-grandparents with sustainable practices. So let's begin the tour. We're going to begin with the traditions of home and hearth, and we're looking at the making of Johnny cakes here at Coggeshall Farm in Bristol, Rhode Island. But this tradition was a tradition of the South Coast as well. And what you see is the making of Johnny cakes with the open hearth on a skittle or on a flat board. Johnny cakes are made of flint corn, which is the native corn, still grown in the area and ground at the local mills. And it then transforms itself with the flour and the water and perhaps even cream and butter goes into it to make a very succulent Johnny cake or journey cake, because they were carried by the early settlers and colonists as they went along the open roads by horseback and carriage. You can see the 19th century is described through Sturbridge Village images here. So you have the milking of the cows. In this case, you can see it's a long-horned cow, which was a period animal, which you don't really see today. The running of the sheep, the barnyards, and then the maple syruping, as well as the pumpkin harvest is being shown. So it takes you through the seasons. And all of those provisions end up in the pantry to be used during the colder months for within the kitchen. From the 18th century of Coggeshall Farm to the 19th century of Sturbridge Village, we enter into the 19th century and early 20th century of the South Coast. In this case, the farmyards. Here you have an archetypal image, almost iconic, of a woman dressed in long white linen dress with her children to her side, with chickens at her feet in front of the barnyard, where her husband is bringing in the cut hay as a farmhand waits within with a wooden pitchfork. That sort of typifies the idea of farm and family that continues to this day. And if you follow down below, you can see that you have the gathering of the corn silage, which was used for the dairy cows for winter autumn and winter feed. And then below you have the modern family at Round the Bend Farm in Dartmouth, Mass. Above, you have the early haying. You'd be using Harlequin oxen. And below, the beginning of the poultry industry. This is the Howland Gifford farm, and this is Mr. Gifford. You can see in this shot, horse and wagons, a water being carried up from the pump house, which is adjacent to an ice pond, and then all of these buildings that make their way across the landscape are poultry barns, as is this farm, the Howland Gifford farm, as well as the Gifford farm, were predominantly poultry producers in the 19th and 20th century into the 20th century. The idea of the farm and farm family as a multi-generational institution is carried on with the George family. Here you have Mr. George and Beatrice, his wife, and two sons, and the aunt and uncle, and they all have worked the farm and continue to work the farm today. The idea of the barnyard and the incorporation of animals is shown in another iconic image of a bearded man, most likely a Quaker, feeding his sheep with the poultry below. It looks like he has a guinea fowl and he has chickens as well, with the very simple split picket fence here and the typical farmhouse of the period. If you consider that image of the 19th century, early 20th century, and then bring it to the 20th century, 21st century, you have Alan Manley bringing out his oxen and with the incredible shadows shot across the lawn here. So you can see the tradition continues from century to century and from one generation to another. As part of the barnyard tradition, you have the Abreu family, who had a humane slaughterhouse that was custom cuts of meat that were done with the gentlest means possible, the quickest means possible. And they had a very high quality meat. And right now, you have Andy Burns of Jordan Farm, who's raising beef cattle and is working on developing a modern slaughterhouse using the same principles of the John Abreu family to allow local farmers to have their animals processed locally in the most humane manner possible. The largest industry of the South Coast for the farming tradition was dairy. There were numbers of dairies, oftentimes family farms, as typified by this South Dartmouth farm here, that raised just enough cows either for their own purposes or to sell. Some bottled and had their own particular dairies that were named. Others were selling the raw milk to places like the Gulf Hill Dairy, who would pasteurize it and bottle it up under their name. And you can see that Gulf Hill delivered and also had added value to the milk by creating an ice cream parlor and a restaurant. And so it was a local institution that you just have as a memory today. Now below, if you can see it, is the part of the slaughterhouse operation. This is John Abreu's dad, and then this is the cold storage of John Abreu's slaughterhouse here, where the animals were hung up to cure in a cold storage room. And if you were to continue with that tradition, We have David Roderick, whose family ran the New Bedford Creamery, and who's been an aficionado and a collector of milk and dairy memorabilia here. And then below you have Reuben and Cy Goldstein, who had both slaughterhouse and a milk operation. Generally, in those days, in the 20th century, the cows, when they were no longer able to be productive, they were brought to slaughter. So oftentimes they would act as brokers between the farmers, and they would, through interviews, they would take the farmers' spent cows and bring them to the slaughterhouse, and then perhaps bring back calves that they could have as replacement animals. So it was sort of a circular route. They found a niche, and they were very successful over the years. But eventually the milk industry died out as there was competition from the south, and the rail and trucking made the milk more accessible from distant places, and the prices plummeted. And the Goldsteins, for example, sold their farms, which became the Dartmouth Mall, part of the Dartmouth Mall. Another booming industry of the South Coast was poultry. And you have the beginnings, as we had showed you, with the Howland Gifford farm and the Gifford farm across the way. Here you have a modern version of this with Copacut Farms, who are maintaining the tradition. They're in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and Vince and Elizabeth have done an amazing job of raising out the Rhode Island Reds for eggs. And I might mention the Rhode Island Red is a local bird with a plaque in Adamsville, Massachusetts, in its honor. And they also raise birds for meat, as well as for turkeys for festivities like Thanksgiving and Christmas. So they offer a modern version of an old take of the poultry, which also suffered from the expansion of the markets and plummeting prices, and they just could not compete. So all of the moldering poultry houses that you see these days, the coops, are a memory of what had been a thriving industry on the South Coast. If you follow the tradition of farming, it was a cyclical tradition that ran from season to season to season to season. In spring, for example, they would be gathering up, they would be shellfishing, they would be seeking the anadromous fish, and which would continue on the South Coast. And then in the autumn times, or summer, autumn, they would be gathering up seaweed. And the seaweed was used, as can be seen in some of these paintings, were gathered from the shore, and they were used to pack the post and beam houses of the old farms to keep out the winter drafts. And in the spring, the seaweed was put onto the garden as a fertilizer, because it's very high in nutrients. And they also gathered the rockweed, which they used to steam the clams as part of the clam bake tradition. Now, what we see here are two gentlemen in Peytonarum who are shucking bay scallops. And the bay scallop is a native shellfish that we don't see as often as we would have in the past. It has something to do with the pollution of the waters and siltation and changes that are affecting the ability of them to survive in these waters. let's look at some of the fisheries that are no longer with us today. For example, the herring at one time ran so thick that you could put down nets and encircle them. Today, they are slowly coming back with the cleansing of the water and the breakup of the dams and the supplying of fish ladders to get them upstream. So what's reassuring, I think, is that this spring we had herring that were literally a foot plus in size, waiting below the dam at the Cummings Mills. There is a fish ladder on the other side. It needs repair. So it shows that the fish are returning. Now, the next step is to make certain they can get upstream to their natal ponds to spawn and then return as they may to see if they're able. Another fishery that is no longer with us is the mackerel fishery on Buzzards Bay. This had supplied the early Allen's Neck clambake because the summer mackerel would come in perfectly timed for the third Thursday in August, which was the traditional date for the Allen's Neck clambake. But today, the waters of Buzzards Bay have warmed beyond the tolerance level of the mackerel, and they no longer come into the bay. But you can see images of when you had these skiffs with their unique sails and the mother boat here, the encircling of the mackerel schools and the bringing in the mackerel, which were then stored in these oak casks, white oak casks. Another fishery that's no longer with us is the sword fishery. This was weighing in a swordfish at Westport Point. Because Dartmouth and Westport are so close to the Gulf Stream, you have these large predatory fish that come between the warm water and the cool, which is the most productive zone, to feed. And when they fed, they rest on the surface, and you can tell the swordfish is there by their curving fins and unusual half-moon tail. So what happens is they would often go out in retrofitted lobster boats, and with a pulpit in the front where they could make their way out and harpoon the swordfish. But oftentimes what they would do is they would put down a dory and they would row slowly and quietly, gliding towards the basking or sleeping swordfish, and then impale. And that was the story of Ginger Pierce and her brother, who Ginger spied a swordfish, a massive swordfish, from she was up the rope ladder to the crow's nest and could see it in the distance. And she clambered down, she called to her brother, they clambered down, they put down the dory, they got as close as they could with the lobster boat, and then put down the dory. Well, what happened is they approached the swordfish, and the brother was able to stand and plunge the harpoon into the fish, which took off. And Ginger was manning the rope, which was within a wooden keg, and it would spin out at incredible speed. So you'd have to be careful of your hands and feet not to be caught up in the line. And then you would catch it. So she caught it. And the fish turned and made its way towards the dory. And the swordfish was larger than the dory. So in this case, what the brother yelled to his sister, to Ginger, let out the line. So they let out the line. And then the fish turned and took off. And with that, the line was stopped, and it towed this dory across the bay at full speed in a Nantucket sleigh ride, while the father tried catching up in the lobster boat. Eventually he did, and was able to plunge a harpoon into the swordfish and bring it on shore, or on deck. And this is an image of bringing the swordfish on deck for another boat, but it's the same principle. Now, what's interesting is that when I was going through Gus Gannett's photograph, I came upon this particular photograph of weighing in the swordfish. And I should mention that this swordfish dressed down to 795 pounds. So it must have been a 1,000-pound swordfish, if you can imagine that, once the head and all of the parts were removed. And this shows, actually, I brought this photograph to Ginger Pierce, and she said, "Joseph," she called me the next day, "do you know the photograph you gave to me?" I said, "Yes." "That's me in the photograph." So it came full circle. There's Ginger at the Westport Point dock with the swordfish. But the swordfish are no longer with us. The swordfish have been overfished to the degree that they no longer frequent these waters as they had in the past. You can find them further north towards Nova Scotia, but they are a dying breed these days because of overfishing and other issues. Now, if we look at shellfishing and lobstering, here we have Seth Garfield of the Cuttyhunk Shellfish Farm leaving the Peyton Aram dock to tend his shellfish beds off of Cuttyhunk. And then below we have John Borden, who's a shell fisherman and lobsterman on Main Road in Westport. And you can see one of the lobsters that he caught from a model of one of his boats below. So what is the future of shellfishing and fishing in the 21st century? We would have to look to aquaculture. Here we have Dale Levitt, who teaches marine biology at Roger Williams University, as well as classes for shell fishermen. In this instance, is developing a added economic benefit for the cranberry growers who have these leaching ponds and who have these irrigation ponds on property. What he's doing is he's raising black bass in pens within these pools, and they in turn are sold as live fish to the fish markets, oftentimes the Chinese markets, who might come out from Boston with special containers to purchase the live fish, which are then displayed in the restaurants for sale. So this is one way of adding value to farming, and that's something that each farmer has to consider these days in a changing economy and with a competition nationally and internationally. Another aquaculturist is Seth Garfield of Cuttyhunk Shellfish, and he grows out incredible oysters on his aquaculture beds off of Cuttyhunk. If we were to look at some of the innovative education, for example, that's in operation today, we can look no further than the New Bedford Votech, who designed an aquaculture facility in which they were breeding out tilapia, and tilapia from the aquarium to the table. It was an experiment that they had, a very successful experiment that they had innovated on over the years. They then went into the yellow perch, and they also, if I'm not mistaken, went into the black bass that was being used as part of restoration efforts by the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So here you have images of the students with one of their aquaculture or hydroponic pools here, and you can see that they are the numbers of fish that they have breeding out here. Now they're also looking at testing of soils and water quality. They do stream flow studies, they do dune restoration, cedar swamp restoration. They're tagging butterflies and monarch butterflies, and they're working in the farms, as well as breeding out endangered turtles for release. So it's quite a very interesting program being hosted through the New Bedford Voctech. If we were to continue, we can look at those people who are using innovative technology, in this case hydroponics, with the growing of strawberries and the growing of golden raspberries and red raspberries by Jim Munger on Division Road in Dartmouth, to the Durfee Mill up above, which is an extraordinary operation of hydroponics on the top floor of a mill. In this case, they have a solar operation. They have water circulating through like veins in a body or in a tree, where the water sort of filters through, feeds, circulates through, and goes down. So they're growing everything from peppers to tomatoes to herbs to lettuces and other greens there. And in the past, they'd even grown melons, with a melon suspended from surgical masks from the rafters to catch their weight. So it's an incredibly innovative operation there. Here you have a traditional farm up above, and so what we see is traditional dairy operation on this upper panel. This is one of the last dairy farms on Fauns Corner Road. We see the farms going, gone. This one continues on, and when I visited, what's amazing is just the friendliness of the cows. You can tell that they've never been harmed. They've always had a good life, and there's a beautiful pasture with walls and hedgerows of maple below the barn buildings that shows you what the area had been at one time. One farm to another, to another, to another. You could cross the pasture land in Dartmouth without ever going onto a street at one time. And this shows you the last of this continuous network of farms on Fauns Corner that stretched all the way across town. One of the innovators for dairy is one of the Ferry boys here, who is continuing at the Pine Hill Dairy. Now, what's amazing about that is that he is a fourth generation farmer. It's at Pine Hill Road in Westport, and he has approximately a 70-acre farmstead. He grazes the cows, and he has 40 milking cows. They produce 2,500 pounds of rich creamery milk each day, and he sells the milk to the wholesale market, but he adds value by producing raw milk in absolutely sterile conditions. And the raw milk is supposedly for people who are sensitive to lactose intolerant. They can drink the raw milk, whereas they couldn't the pasteurized milk. And the raw milk is supposedly better for you. He's hoping to add extra value by working with his cousins at the Golden Robin, that's the Peckham family, who grow out the most sumptuous strawberries, to make a yogurt. So that's the future plan, is to sell the raw milk, but also to use it in the making of the yogurt blended with fresh fruit. And then below is a very successful operation. This is the Shy Brothers operation, and there are a number of brothers. In this case, it's the Santos Brothers farm and out on Main Road in Westport. And the issue with dairies these days is the cost of milk fluctuates. So you really can't have a steady income that is reliable. So what they had the brainstorm of doing is to take the milk from the farm and then produce a very special cheese called clomage, which is in a French tradition, and also these small cheeses that are flavored with lavender or chives, or other flavors, or just the French, what they call thimbles. And those thimbles of cheese are also one of their specialties. And they named these thimbles Hannibals after their mother. And the clomage was a French-style soft cheese for spreading and cooking. And they also make a really mouth-watering mozzarella there, which I can attest is really good. So what they've done is they've created a national, even international business from the tradition of the Fonts Corner dairy to the raw milk to the dairy into cheese. So you have to add value as a farmer these days, otherwise you cannot survive in these tough economic times. With that, you can see the farmers and fishers' portraits, words, and tools on view at the town hall through the close of June, with the potential for an extended stay here. Thank you for joining us today.